The skull is a complex bony structure that forms the framework of the head. It serves several vital functions, protecting the brain, supporting the organs of special senses, forming the facial skeleton, and providing attachment points for muscles involved in mastication, facial expression, and head movement. Anatomically, the skull is an intricate assembly of bones joined primarily by fibrous joints called sutures. So that being said, let's look at the anatomy of the skull properly. The adult human skull is composed of 22 bones, excluding the auditory ossicles and the hyoid bone. These bones are traditionally divided into two major parts, the neurocranium and the viscerocranium. The neurocranium forms the protective case around the brain, while the viscerocranium forms the skeletal framework of the face. The skull bones are mostly flat bones, developing by intramembranous ossification, except for a few that develop partly by endochondral ossification. Let's start with the neurocranium. The neurocranium consists of 8 bones that enclose and protect the brain. These bones form a rigid box known as the cranial vault and base. They include 1. Frontal bone, forms the forehead, the roof of the orbits, and the anterior cranial fossa. It contains the frontal sinuses and contributes to the supraorbital margins. 2. Parietal bones are paired bones that form the sides and roof of the cranial vault. They meet at the midline at the sagittal suture. 3. Temporal bones are also paired bones located on the inferolateral aspects of the skull. These bones house the structures of the middle and inner ear. Important landmarks include the mastoid process, styloid process, and the external acoustic meatus. 4. Occipital bone forms the posterior part of the skull and the base. It contains the foramen magnum, through which the brainstem connects to the spinal cord. 5. Sphenoid bone, a complex, butterfly-shaped bone that forms part of the cranial base. It contributes to the orbits and contains the sella turcica, which houses the pituitary gland. 6. Ethmoid bone, a light, spongy bone located between the orbits. It contributes to the nasal cavity, nasal septum, and medial orbital walls, and contains the cribriform plate for olfactory nerve fibers. Then there is the second part, which is the viscerocranium. The viscerocranium is made up of 14 bones and forms the facial skeleton. These bones support the eyes, nose, mouth, and jaws. Maxillae are paired bones that form the upper jaw and part of the hard palate, nasal cavity, and orbits. They contain the maxillary sinuses and alveolar processes for the upper teeth. Zygomatic bones are paired bones that form the cheekbones and contribute to the lateral walls of the orbits. Nasal bones are also paired small bones forming the bridge of the nose. Lacrimal bones are paired thin bones forming part of the medial wall of the orbit and housing the lacrimal sac. Palatine bones are paired L-shaped bones that form the posterior part of the hard palate and part of the nasal cavity. Inferior nasal conchae are paired curved bones projecting into the nasal cavity, increasing surface area for air filtration and humidification. Voma, 1 forms the posterior inferior part of the nasal septum. Mandible, 1 the largest and strongest facial bone, forming the lower jaw. It is the only movable bone of the skull and articulates with the temporal bone at the temporomandibular joint. Sutures and joints of the skull. Most skull bones are joined by sutures, which are immovable fibrous joints. Major sutures include lambdoid suture, between the parietal bones and occipital bone. Squamous suture, between the temporal and parietal bones. The temporomandibular joint, TMJ, is a synovial joint between the mandible and temporal bone, allowing movements necessary for chewing and speech. Now let's talk about the cranial fossae. The internal base of the skull is divided into 3 depressions called cranial fossae, which support different parts of the brain. Anterior cranial fossa houses the frontal lobes of the brain. It is formed by the frontal bone, ethmoid bone, and sphenoid bone. Middle cranial fossa supports the temporal lobes. It is formed mainly by the sphenoid and temporal bones. Posterior cranial fossa contains the cerebellum, pons, and medulla oblongata. It is formed by the occipital bone and parts of the temporal bones.